Hi everyone, welcome to today's session. Prepare yourself. ILT as we knew it is never coming back. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. This session will run approximately 60 minutes with about 10 minutes of Q&A time. This session recording will be made available for all attendees. As the audience, you're welcome to view the presentation slides provided with the slide widget at the bottom bar. There, you will also be able to submit questions throughout the presentation with the Q&A widget. Feel free to explore the additional widgets at the bottom, such as the media player functions, social media activities, and assets provided by the presenters. Lastly, once the session concludes, there will be a prompted survey that we'd love to hear your feedback on the session. And with that, our session will start soon.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Ben Willis, and I am responsible for strategy and alliances here at Inkling, and I am delighted to be joined today by Nyla Reed, who is founding partner at the EDUCE Group, one of the many talented partners that make up the Inkling partner community. Nyla has more than 20 years of experience in the world of learning and, in her role at EDUCE, specializes in the implementation and adoption of learning and talent management technologies and strategies for large, complex organizations. For most of us, just the title of today's session, Prepare Yourself, ILT as we knew it is never coming back, is a scary and perhaps controversial thought. And many will recall that this is not the first time that ILT has been pronounced dead. By the late 1990s, learning management systems have become prevalent in corporate America, which led to the explosion of e-learning capabilities throughout the 2000s. Many thought this would surely lead to the death of ILT as e-learning replaced it, but it did not. Instead, both forms of learning continued to coexist, although some might argue that not enough thought was given to how they were brought together. We find ourselves at a similar crossroads today, where the emergence of COVID-19 is forcing organizations worldwide to rethink and reimagine how they will deliver learning initiatives. Many of you have been early adopters and thought leaders along this journey. For some, this session may be about how you can take the best of what you've already built and leverage it going forward. For others, you may be looking for ways to assist peers down this new path. Inkling tends to live at the intersection of learning and operations. So whether you look after one or both, our hope is there is something here for everyone. To rewind a bit, it's probably safe to say that for most people, 2020 started out as an exciting year full of hope and promise. But today, if we asked you how your year is going, we're guessing you might be responding a bit more like this.
Or bewildered.
Bewildered. Dazed and confused. Perhaps others actually might respond a bit more like this, with 2020 being quite the year. What is certain is that 2020 has been a year of big changes and broad uncertainty that has impacted all of us in ways many of us never could have imagined. Looking around at all of this change and impact, it is easy to become discouraged and frustrated. Whether you are part of a traditional learning organization or you're tasked with ensuring that operations run smoothly, our worlds have been turned upside down. But not to worry. If we look at these changes in a broader context, we feel there are many good reasons to be hopeful. In many ways, it is not that something great is no longer possible. It's more likely that something flawed is in the process of being upgraded or redefined. To begin that conversation, let me turn it over to Nyla.
Ben. So before we jump into the discussion on learning, I thought it would be good for us to take a few moments and look at the evolution of communication. So all of us remember when letters were the main way to communicate. I remember in high school over the summer, I had friends who were going to camp. The only way we were able to communicate is by sending letters back and forth through the US mail. And we also remember when phones were plugged into walls. So we went through a major change as we started typing messages on computers and adopting email, and as we took calls pretty much anytime, anywhere on our cell phones. But for each step in this transformation, there was a specific equation of things that were gained as well as things that were given up. So for example, with email, we quickly adapted to the idea that we could get immediate response from people. We didn't have to wait for that mail to be delivered. It just popped up in our inboxes. But conversely, we also very quickly lost our 9-to-5 workday. There was no longer that boundary. We ended up taking calls, in our cars on the way to work. We ended up taking calls during dinner time. But all of these things really combined, the good and the bad, to create the way that we see communication today. And I would say that we are in a similar transformation today. So while many are saying that the death of ILT has been thrust upon us, I would say that the truth is traditional ILT has already been experiencing pressure on many fronts. So let's take a look at this. Internally, we all know that corporations, over the past years have been reducing travel budgets. So you really have to come up with that justification of why people need to fly around to be in a classroom at the same time. But in addition, more people are responsible for developing training. And these people who are often developing our content today are not instructional designers. They're not trained facilitators. They're subject matter experts that know how things should be done, but they don't have the background that many of our instructors and instructional designers bring to the table. So it's a very different set of people who we are giving responsibility to for delivering training and ensuring that our employees perform as expected. From a learner perspective, our employees are coming to the workplace with different expectations as well. So I do think that the Netflix analogy has been overplayed. I've heard it so many times, but it doesn't make it untrue. Learners do want learning to be recommended to them based on other training that they've completed. And they also want to find learning resources and information when they need it. So meeting learner expectations in terms of delivering that consumerized experience that they see in other facets of their life has become very important and a predominant request in the workplace. But more broadly, our industry continues to confront an accelerated pace of change. Information is outdated as quickly as it gets disseminated. And in those situations, that makes ILT a lot less appealing because you can't bring everyone together again every time something changes. So add all of these situations kind of evolving over time to contribute to what COVID basically just decided for us. We were already experiencing situations that made ILT less effective, but the pandemic made the delivery of ILT impossible. So it just accelerated a change that I think was inevitable. Ben, would you agree with this analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the learner expectations piece is worth exploring in a bit more detail. Inkling CEO Jeff Carr recently did a webinar with Michael Rochelle at the Brandon Hall Group on what we've begun calling the new Learner Manifesto. And I think it's worth revisiting to see if we're delivering, and if not, if we can use these COVID times of change as an opportunity to take our learning to the next level. The first element of this new Learner Manifesto is relevancy. It goes without saying that we all want our learning content to be relevant, right? We want it to be tailored to me and to my job as much as possible. But it should also be contextualized, meaning it may be valuable to separate traditional learning like IT security training or team building skills from the more mission critical learning that is needed to run and drive the business and make it very clear to learners how and where to find each. Just as importantly, the next element of the manifesto is accessibility. They want to be able to learn when, where, and how they want, including on their smartphone and on the go. So not only does your mission critical learning content need to automatically adapt to the device they select, but getting to that content needs to be a breeze. It needs to be absolutely frictionless. Learners today will not tolerate a complex login process, and once in, they're not going to want to be lost in a sea of irrelevant information. They want to be able to search and find exactly what they need to do their jobs at that moment. Unfortunately, as yesterday's learning management systems have evolved into today's talent management systems, learners are now confronted with a sea of information that is not always relevant, from generic learning content to performance reviews to compensation plans and much, much more. All of this adds friction to the process that can easily hurt effective learning in the moment of need. Similarly, yesterday's content was designed for yesterday, not today. We've all experienced the pain of death by next button surrounding most corporate learning initiatives. Compare that to how we learn on the web, where we search for what we want to know, thumb scroll through the resulting content until we find what we need, perhaps watch a video or otherwise engage with that content, then move on once we have learned what we need to know. Organizational learning needs to be equally easy and to access and equally engaging. Lastly, learners are done being trained in one place and then sent somewhere completely different when they need the information to do their jobs. They're highly frustrated to be working with always out-of-date content, a problem inherent in content formats like PDF or PowerPoint. Learners desperately want a single source of truth. Unfortunately, most of the tools that many of us use to create and deliver e-learning content today are also part of that same problem. Just like PowerPoint and PDF content is out of date the moment it is released, e-learning content like SCORM packages suffer from this same challenge, resulting in learning systems that are not trusted as a source of truth. To make matters worse, when learners search in most systems, they are taken to courses, not specific pages within the course that might contain the answers to their questions. Modern learners want to be able to find answers and learn at the moment of need.
So let's compare what learners want, as Ben just described, to what they typically get. With instructor-led training, the effectiveness of the class often depends on the instructor. And we've all been in this situation where we see firsthand that the instructor is the one that determines whether the learner has a good or a bad experience. If we start at the left end of the spectrum with lecture, we all know communication is essentially one way, and the instructor is delivering a planned message and really saying, this is the way it is. So not offering a lot of interactivity, a lot of questioning. It truly is just dissemination of information and an expectation that all of the people attending that lecture are going to take notes and follow what's said. Next on the spectrum, we have discussion. So this is where the instructor directs the conversation, but learners still have some level of participation. But what we really want is an experiential classroom. So this third item in the spectrum. And this is where learners are able to try things out through role play or through other kind of simulation activities. This type of in-class authentic assessment allows for learners to try out a skill or technique you want them to use on the job. And it also allows for real-time feedback in a safer environment so that people have the ability to run through things before they have to truly do it in the workplace, on the floor, in their offices and such. So Ben, I think that you could say that there's a similar spectrum when it comes to content as well, right?
No question about it. A very similar notion, very parallel sort of continuum applies to content. While PowerPoint and PDFs may be just fine in a pinch for compliance scenarios, as a vehicle for actual learning, we know that they are highly ineffective. Providing more interactive content not only makes learning more engaging, it also makes it more memorable. When you no longer have the advantage of meeting face-to-face with your learners, it is critical that your content encourages better connectivity. PowerPoint, PDF, other forms of traditional content are inherently limited. Their static, flat nature restricts the user interaction to page turning and scrolling, which in turn hampers the ability to achieve learning objectives. Modern content, by contrast, allows for true interactivity through the use of flip cards, image carousels, videos, interactive quizzes, and much, much more. And it is easily searchable, so that it can be referenced at the moment of need. Very important. It is safe to say that modern learning looks a lot more like Google and YouTube than what we see today in most corporate learning ecosystems. So, if all of that is true, then where to from here? In short, we think it is time to rethink learning to deliver something that is much better adapted to today's highly dynamic and increasingly agile world. And in many ways, none of this is new. We just find ourselves in a situation where COVID has accelerated the need to act now. The good news is the global learning community has long demonstrated a willingness to innovate and find powerful new ways of learning. So if ILT is no longer an option, then it is time to find a new way of reaching our learners.
Great. So then the question is, what should this new way look like? And I think that this is the opportunity to really reinvent the way that we think about learning. So if you recall the end state of the instructor spectrum we just talked about a few minutes ago, we highlighted the effectiveness of interactivity and of group exercises, and just, in general, allowing people to try out the skills and techniques as you would want to see them performed in a workplace setting. And this would also give these same employees the opportunity to receive real-time feedback and correct things and learn. On the content side, as Ben mentioned, we want to address the learner experience and all their expectations that they are bringing from their experiences outside of work. They have this demand to be able to quickly and easily access learning resources that has not always been met. And we didn't really talk about this, but I think it's also important to take into account organizational needs. And the fact that having consistent analytics allows for continuous evaluation of a company's learning program. And it also surfaces areas that require improvement. So our challenge is to look at these different modalities and merge the two.
Perfect. So it goes without saying, we're in the middle of some very big changes, and there are a lot of unknowns. But at the same time, there are many things that we do know. So now and I thought, maybe we should start with that.
So to start off, what we know is that at this moment in time, ILT is simply not an option. That effectively has been taken away from us. But what we've also learned in the last several months is that directly transferring what we used to deliver as ILT into virtual instructor-led training is also not working. So you can't take that 1 day, 2 day, 1 week set of sessions that you used to have people fly in for and take as a cohort. That just can't be delivered as 1 day, 2 days, or God forbid, 1 whole week of online sessions. And we've seen that these lengthy Zoom sessions are exhausting and ineffective. And one of the reasons for that is because everyone is working from home, which truly is a definition of a distraction-rich environment. So you're not getting the attention that you might have gotten by taking people out of their typical workplace and putting them in a classroom setting, often in a different city or different location from their normal workplace. So setting that aside, let's also talk about what we know when it comes to learning organizations and what they are being asked to do. Our learning and development organizations are under crazy amounts of pressure right now. I know that there are many places where people were taken off of lots of different initiatives and basically challenged to take existing programs and as quickly as possible convert them into something else that could still be deployed even though people were not in the office and everyone was working from home. But what we also saw is that because of the time pressures, people were being asked to do this really quickly, and because of resource constraints, sometimes this was being tasked in addition to all of the responsibilities that learning employees are already asked to meet, that something else became kind of the lowest common denominator. So it became PDFs, it became super quick PowerPoints, or, as Ben had mentioned, some of those dull page turner web-based trainings. But there's also a positive here, and I thought it was important to kind of look at some statistics that predated COVID. So we also know that virtual classroom truly is mainstream. If you look at some statistics from 2019, 93% of organizations were already using VILT at some point in time. We've also seen that session times have already been trending shorter. So whereas in 2012, the average VILT session was somewhere in the range of 60 to 90 minutes, that average had been reduced by 2019 to 60 minutes, with a good amount of people, about 15%, reporting that their average sessions were 45 minutes or less. And so we've also seen people taking that first step into breaking things into chunks and taking these shorter events and then combining them into series so that people would have a break in between these shorter sessions.
So clearly, just throwing everything over the wall into one-way Zoom sessions is not working. We all know, we can feel it. We're experiencing it in our everyday lives. But obviously, we still find ourselves under immense pressure to convert existing programs into something new. So if that's right, Nala, then what are some of the next steps that you see people taking? How do we go about introducing some of these changes into our organizations? And are you seeing any sort of best practices emerge?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be a good use of our time today to focus on 3 areas in particular. So one would be better use of virtual classroom. The second is re-envisioning blended learning. And the third is just, our approach to empowering our learners. So let's start with virtual classrooms. I think that incorporating certain techniques will help gauge participant understanding and also encourage interaction. So first, and this may seem obvious, but it really has to be done deliberately, is getting your participants talking. So, the first step here is just making sure that as a person leading a virtual session that you're pausing often for questions. Sometimes we just get on a roll and keep talking and forget that we have these these learners that want to engage and want to interact. So pausing for questions is kind of the first level, but then also building in times to engage participants. So asking them to share their experiences, having them provide examples, or otherwise expanding on topics that you're introducing as part of the agenda. A second technique is utilizing the chat window. So this could be used if you have a lot of employees and you want to be able to collect lots of learner responses and you can't pause to have all the possible people give a verbal response. But it's also a great way to capture questions that you can either answer along the way and incorporate into your delivery or use as a way to follow up with everybody afterwards. And then finally, I think everyone should be very deliberate about scheduling breaks. So learners are going to be less likely to stray if they know that there are going to be planned times to check email, stretch, or just take a break. couple other ideas, more for the folks that are putting together these virtual sessions. It is really important to minimize the amount of text that you have on a page, and where possible, use pictures and visuals to depict the concepts that you're trying to explain. That ends up being much better absorbed. It makes the learning more engaging. Also, leveraging the tools within the tool that you're using. So, many of these virtual classroom tools have built right in the ability to have polls, to gauge, participant response, to have pop quizzes, so you can, ensure that they're learning the information that you're delivering. Leveraging breakout rooms, so breaking people up into small groups, giving them some sort of topic to discuss, and then coming back and having them report out. That really helps with accountability. And then finally, whiteboarding, so that it's not just static slides, but something that's actually dynamic that you're seeing. All of these techniques really help break up lecture style delivery and make sure that the attendees in your class are engaged and accountable within the session. And then finally, and I think we've had a lot of experience with this in the last several months, actually using our cameras and being able to see people's faces. So putting in that FaceTime. All of these techniques just help to make sure that the learning is more engaging and that people are actually paying attention. So second, we also need to rethink blended learning. And, if you go back to the original concept of blended learning, it was really formulated with ILT as a centerpiece. So learners were asked to read documents or perhaps take a quiz prior to the class as a prerequisite. And that enabled them to come to the class with background on the topic or perhaps an assessment of their existing knowledge so that the instructor knew the backgrounds of the people coming in and you could tailor the content accordingly. And then after the classroom training, there was often a follow-up in the form of a post-class assessment or just offering up supplementary resources that learners could optionally consume if they were interested. So I like to think about this like a meal. The prereqs are the appetizer, the ILT is the main course, and the post-class follow-up is the dessert. Now the challenge that we have today is like our entree has been taken away. But instead of taking that porterhouse steak and replacing it with a pan-roasted chicken, we really need to rethink all of this. And my idea is we're really replacing it with tapas. Ben, I know you like tapas. So, it's a small plate of manchego, it's the garlic shrimp. It's a lot of small little things rather than replacing that big chunk that used to be ILT with another big chunk of something. So what does this look like? When planning out delivery, you have to keep in mind that while you may have been able to accomplish traditional classroom training in 2 days, virtual classroom segments should be kept much, much shorter. And if you're incorporating and embedding self-paced modules, those learners are going to be completing those self-paced items on their own schedules. So even though the end result in terms of training hours may end up being the same, you're going to need more calendar time to be allocated in order for everyone to complete the curriculum. I think a second thing to think about, and I remember back in college when professors had office hours, and using that approach to either offer pre-session coaching, depending on the topic, if that's relevant, or post-session follow-up so that if people have questions as they start utilizing the information they learned, or if perhaps there just wasn't enough time to get to all the questions and somebody wanted a one-on-one session, that office hours approach applied in the workplace is a great way to ensure accessibility to your employees to get the questions answered that they have or getting the additional help if they need it. And then, not to beat a dead horse, but The VILT sessions that are part of this new blended learning need to be really purposeful. They need to be short, they need to be interactive. It takes a lot of planning, but you need to make sure that you have a really discrete set of points that you want to get across and proactively plan the ways that you're going to have your attendees be participants and be engaged in that session. So lastly, we also need to empower our learners. When we talked about the instructor spectrum earlier, we discussed how the more effective sessions were those where the learners were engaged and interacting, and when the instructor was really more of a facilitator than delivering all of the content. And this is key to our new model. Learners need to feel empowered to find the learning that they need to do their jobs and grow their careers. So, taking this a few steps further, letting learners almost choose their own adventure. So you're always going to have these mandatory components and sets of training that people must take, but give them access to additional resources so that people who want to take it to the next step can. And then providing ongoing performance support. So making learning continuous, whether that's through the coaching sessions or through other methods, instead of having training just be a moment in time.
Agreed, 100%. And when I think about engaging and empowering learners, or rather engaging and empowering learners, I love this quote from Jason Morgan at Hike Vision. Yikes. Don't be afraid to step out of the box and try something new. The average learner today is not the average learner that we dealt with 20 years ago. The engagement that you can get out of an employee today might surprise you.
So, given what we have learned so far regarding delivery of these sessions and some of the techniques that we've seen to be more effective, what are our next steps?
Well, first, it is clearly time to shift our focus from learning as an event to learning as a capability. This, I think we all would agree, is at the very heart of the new move towards what many are calling learning in the flow of work. As Nyla noted, in the traditional learning model, we focus on lecture and perhaps a test, and then we hold that up as proof that the learner mastered the material. We track course completions and assessment scores as key metrics. But this is often a big distraction from really driving effective performance, because people aren't given an opportunity to apply what they learned, so quickly forget what they were taught and are unable to apply it at the moment of need. This model slows everything down. What is needed is a mind shift, where we begin to shift our focus from just creating learning events to enabling what we are calling learning at work speed. To do this, we need to empower employees with capabilities and opportunities and tools that mirror methods we are all used to in our everyday lives. Again, models like Google and YouTube that follow the find, learn, do model.
So our challenge is to take the best of instructor-led training and the best part of self-paced learning to create the equivalent of what the smartphone is to communication, going back to the analogy that we started with. So ILT is not dead, but we do need to think about it differently moving forward. And just like the smartphone combined oral and written communication into one device, we need to take the two modalities of instructor-led training and self-paced online learning to create what will be the learning of the future.
Perfect. So according to a recent report on COVID impacts from the Fosway Group, 71% of organizations have experienced an increased demand for this digital learning from end users directly. But at the same time, traditional e-learning shows signs of waning in both adoption and perceived success. So in many ways, we find ourselves at a pivotal moment for learning and operations professionals, where we can change the conversation around learning and move it from a process that is reactive to a capability that can be used to drive agility into the business. This is huge. To give just one source of inspiration, Taco Bell invested in future-proofing their learning programs years ago and now uses the Inkling platform to launch a new menu item every 6 weeks to over 7,500 restaurants nationwide. This is truly learning at scale. This modern approach to learning has not only allowed them to leverage learning as a capability, it has also empowered team members and dramatically improved customer satisfaction along the way. In times like these, this ability for the business to pivot on a dime is more critical than ever. Okay, with that, Niall and I would like to thank you all very much for your time today. We hope everyone got something out of today's session. Please do not hesitate to reach out with any questions or comments or feedback you might have. We would really appreciate it. We've also reserved some time for questions, so feel free to stick around for that, and we will jump into that next. Thanks again.
All right, fantastic. So hopefully that was helpful for everyone. Again, hope everyone got something out of it. We've had some good questions come into the Q&A as we've gone here, so I'm going to go ahead and pull those up now. So first question, Nyla, folks are asking. So this all sounds great. What kinds of governance models would you recommend to support rolling out this type of initiative?
So first, a governance framework is absolutely needed, especially with all of the rethinking that's going on in terms of what content is important, what needs to be disseminated, who it needs to be disseminated to. I would say that creating a framework where there is some guidance provided regarding what mechanisms you use, whether it's a virtual classroom tool for certain content, leveraging office hours, as we had mentioned, or developing some sort of self-paced content. Anyone who's responsible for developing this training needs to have some sort of guidance in terms of what tools should be used at what point, as well as assistance on how to leverage a combination of tools to create a cohesive curriculum. I would suggest picking one or two critical training programs that really need to be transformed immediately and using that as a model to then deploy to the rest of your organization. Ben, did you have anything to add in terms of governance?
Well, I have a question to add that seems perfectly dovetailed. How about we switch to that? So another question came out in that sort of in that same vein. How does ILT fit into a world where content is increasingly disposable? How do we make the decision on what will become ILT?
Oh, good question. So let's think back, 15, 20 years when pretty much everything was ILT, and the first decision that had to be made is what are we going to translate into web-based training and what's going to stay ILT. And I think the decision at that time was anything that was informational, where there really was no debate. It was, here are the 5 steps to complete this process, or here are the 3 things you need to learn. Those were the easiest items to translate into web-based training. What we missed there was no check in terms of absorption of that content. There was no measure of whether or not after consuming that content, somebody could perform the way you expected. So I think it's still the case where anytime there needs to be an exchange of ideas or you want to foster discussion or collaboration, some ILT component needs to occur. And that could be, as we discussed during this session, using a combination of some of that self-paced training, either prefaced by or followed up by the virtual sessions where you can then talk about your ideas as well as ask questions. So I guess bottom line, it needs to continue to be interspersed. Like, what we're not saying is just put everything into content and let things go. There needs to be some sort of collaboration, some sort of forum where people can ask questions, and a mechanism where the instructors, facilitators, or supervisors can gauge learner understanding.
Yeah, agreed, 100%. It's interesting, actually, because in this new kind of world, it's putting increased sort of focus on the flip the classroom model, which I think was quite the buzz for a while and then maybe kind of faded a bit. For those not familiar, the idea with flip the classroom is that basically you flip things upside down. Instead of the classroom being where the lecture is happening and sort of the learning in quotation marks, you take all that lecture offline, right? And it becomes much more of a self-paced activity that the learners are expected to accomplish sort of on their own, and they come into these sessions, which are then much more focused on, Q&A and, practice, like, live, ideally sort of hands-on live practice, and then in true ILT world, more of the experiential side of things. In this increasingly kind of virtual world, that works very, very well. In fact, that kind of lends itself to that perfectly. It does, however, at the same time raise the bar considerably on how good your content is. It's happening offline or outside the classroom, right? That content now all of a sudden needs to be significantly more engaging, because those learners are in fact having and wanting to do that in a self-paced fashion. All right, more questions. So, obviously, all this is great, right? I want to bring it to my organization. You talked about a learner manifesto, but then is there also kind of an equivalent executive manifesto as it pertains to learning? How do we, make the most sense of this for future business?
So first of all, I think it is important to take into consideration what employees want. We want satisfied employees. We want to be able to retain them. We want to develop them so that all of the investment that we have made stays within the organization, all that knowledge stays within the organization. But there's also a component of what is best for the business. What I would say is that incorporating a lot of these techniques that we have been talking about, and that frankly we've been pushed to talk about because of the pandemic, is leading us to really refine what is absolutely needed and what is going to drive our business forward. I think it's pretty amazing when you look across organizations at what they have done over the last 6 months with very little or no preparation at all to ensure that operations continued, that people were ready for their roles, all doing it a different way. So, looking beyond when things, quote unquote, go back to normal, I think that there's a lot of benefit of taking what we've learned and continuing to apply it to make things more efficient, but, also more productive.
Yeah, agreed 100%. For those that, part of that question gets to sort of like making the case, right, making the business case. So for those that attended this morning's keynote and then the executive panel that followed, there's a lot of really good information there to help you kind of with that. Also, Blake did a great session on analytics that I thought was fantastic, and another sort of good resource for sort of teasing out some of that ROA conversation that you want to have with your executives. All right, so we're down to the last minute, so I'm going to end this one the same way that the executive panel ended, which is to ask you, Nyla, if your clients are seeing any kind of silver linings in the pandemic.
I would say yes. So, really it was kind of a critical time where people had to react. I mean, to me, it's always a silver lining when conditions enable you to push things forward without having to go through, the red tape that many of us have to endure getting things approved. And we were able to fast track a lot of things. So, on a personal level, I love that notion of being able to kind of come up with an immediate fix and deploy it and see it be successful. So, the innovation that so many teams were able to muster and deploy, I think, has been pretty amazing. Especially organizations that almost solely relied on instructor-led training, bringing people into a classroom, having people, in person on a factory floor, having to come up with ways, on the fly to navigate around that. It has been a real success story.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was really interesting. There's a quote, I think, in the Avid session where, as a result of kind of all this big bang change, there was a sense of sort of community and a sense of kind of we're all in this together. And people were much more sort of open and willing to kind of lean into the change and do it together. And so I think that kind of sort of underscores that same point. All right. Well, we are at the end of time. I want to thank Nyla so much for her time this morning. I thought it was a great session, great content. Appreciate that, Nyla. And obviously, if folks have more questions, we'd love to continue the dialogue. You can hit educegroup.com. I think we shared Nyla's personal contact information as well. So thanks, everyone, for your time.
Thank you.